Good evening. Again, to some of you who were here for the Pell School presentation earlier. Hope you enjoyed the canapes this evening. Slightly different format for this evening. So we've had the Pell School presentation, had the canapes. I've got Professor Adam Hart here to give the lecture for the evening, and then we'll have the AGM after the lecture. So a packed evening. I'm going to hand over to Professor Hart, and we'll get stuck in.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a lovely dinner. It's usual to have to sing for your supper, but normally you have to sing before your supper. So I feel like I should just leave now. No. So yeah, I want to talk about predators and people, and it relates to a book which is a surprise to me, but very nice surprise that it's on sale outside, called A Deadly Balance. And the thing about predators, which is quite interesting, is that although most of us don't have much experience of them in our everyday lives, they are something that completely fascinates and intrigues us. A very nice study was done a while ago that looked at charisma. And the idea was to look at the most charismatic species. And it was quite an inclusive study where they looked at all kinds of different indicators of charisma in terms of species that are used in advertising, species that appear in films, in books, species that are most studied. They did surveys of people to find out what people thought. And they came up with this amazing sort of pictogram here of the 20 most charismatic species in the way that they were defining it. And what's interesting to me, I don't think there are necessarily many surprises on there, but what's interesting to me is that almost half of them, and 3 out of the top 5 are predators. Tigers, lions. Interestingly, number 5 is not even a species, panther. By which people mean black panther, they mean melanistic leopards or jaguars. You've got cheetahs, polar bears, wolves, sharks. I was surprised not to find them a little bit higher, but I think people are a little bit kind of biased against ocean predators. Crocodiles, bears. The fact is, we like things with teeth and claws. We like organisms that can harm us. That's why dinosaurs are so popular, right? They're big, fierce, and extinct. We love those things. And once you start looking for predators in everyday life, you find them in a remarkable number of company logos, huge numbers. This is just a smattering of them, but you'll see obviously jaguars, lions, tigers, pumas, crocodiles, all over the place. And of course, we've got lots and lots of films based around them. Marvelous Jaws, one of the best films ever, of course, but also things like The Revenant, Idris Elba fighting lions. I don't recommend that, by the way. You're not going to come off best. Hyenas, crocodile attack. This is a truly awesomely, epically awful film. I thoroughly recommend it. But one of my personal favourites, this gets on ITV every 6 months or so, Anaconda. Truly one of the most awful, brilliant films ever made. John Voight, Angelina Jolie, absolutely dreadful, love it. All about a massive snake that's hunting people down in a sort of semi-intelligent way. But we love these things. We absolutely love them, and not just in sort of non-fiction, but also, not just in fiction, but also in non-fiction. And if you think about many of the most successful wildlife programs recently that featured predators, the hunt predators. We got Steve Backshaw's got a sort of whole industry around the deadly 60, now, which is like the sort of not so deadly 100, and then sort of after a while, just things that are a bit predatory. But nonetheless, we love these sorts of organisms, right? We're fascinated by them in all sorts of ways. But when you start looking around the world at people that live alongside predators, things change a little bit. I did these searches a while ago now. Leopard attacks, 1.5 million results very, very quickly. Boy killed, leopard killed. Leopard kills a boy, leopard kills another boy. Crocodiles killing people, tigers killing people. I'm on a WhatsApp group now with conservationists in India. At least twice a day, I get alerts of leopards or tigers killing people. It's happening all across. India is a hotbed of human-wildlife conflict now. I got sent a video a few days ago. A politician is being inaugurated inside one of the major buildings, government buildings, north of Delhi. And as he goes up to sign it on live news, in the background, across the top of a set of steps, inside the building, you can see a leopard walking across. Now, leopards are very plentiful in parts of India. They're feeding on feral dogs around the outside, which the government won't control, and are taking people. They are killing lots and lots of people. And the same with tigers. So although we think of them as amazing, charismatic creatures, actually the people that live alongside them are increasingly finding themselves in conflict with them. And I was interested in this from various field work that I was doing in Southern Africa, particularly in South Africa, I started hearing stories from people about predators, about lions, about leopards, hyenas. And a guy that I interviewed for a Radio 4 program looking at rhino poaching was actually killed and partly eaten by a lion about 6 months later. And so it sort of became something that I became quite interested in. So I pitched to Radio 4 a program which became known as On the Menu. I would have pushed back harder against this title now. I think it's quite a glib title that I'm not particularly pleased with. You know, it's kind of making a joke out of it. It's not a joke at all. But in that program, we explored various different predators and their influence and effects on people in terms of predation, human eating. And then that led to writing a book. And then the idea of that book was to explore which predators actually consume us as prey. I'm not talking about animals which may attack us, and I'm not talking about animals that could consume us, like, for example, fly maggots. I'm talking about animals that single us out as part of their prey spectrum. And there are a surprisingly large number. To examine the extent to which those predators are a problem for us, but also us for them, because these are conservation concern issues too, right? And we've got to think of both sides of that balance. And I think that's what we often fail to do when we're looking at predators. And to just gain some understanding of what it's like to live alongside those sorts of animals. Yeah, imagine if where I live, just north of Gloucestershire, just north of Gloucester, there's a lovely sort of, the Severn runs through, and it's all very nice. If it was warm, it would be superb crocodile habitat. Absolutely brilliant. Now, how many dog walkers do you think would need to be attacked? How many Jack Russells would need to be taken by a crocodile before all of those crocodiles would be eradicated? And yet, in Africa, in parts of Africa, you've got high densities of Nile crocodiles consuming people, and those crocodiles still live in those rivers, and those people live alongside them. So we need to understand this sort of dynamic if we want to be conserving wildlife, which is actively harmful to people, and to look at ways that we can reduce those conflicts. So a sort of brief survey, really, of species which will actively predate us revealed a few surprises. I was expecting to find lions and tigers and sort of leopards. Jaguars, people will tell you, oh, jaguars, there's no reports of a jaguar ever taking a human being. It's absolute rot. There are lots of reports of them. They're a large predatory cat. They will take people on occasion. Crocodilians are the hugest or the largest of those predators. Nile crocodiles, particularly saltwater crocodiles, take lots of people. Mostly not in Australia, actually mostly in Indonesia, but they don't get reported because they're not surfers on holiday. They're poor rural fishermen. Yeah, these are the sorts of stories which we're going to be bringing out, but also a few surprises. There are a number of eagle species which are truly massive: the martial eagle, the crowned eagle, Philippine eagle, harpy eagle, white-tailed eagle. There are a couple of good authenticated reports of martial eagles and crowned eagles in Southern Africa targeting children. So there's some good evidence for that. Piranhas will take people. I don't recommend you Google any of the medical papers involved in them because they are horrific. Some of the wounds that are inflicted, but they will take people rarely. Whales, catfish, freshwater fish. Good reports of them eating people. Snakes, very large snakes, particularly very large pythons, will take people. I first heard of a story where a railway worker in Southern Africa, South Africa, near to where I work, was having a little toilet visit in the middle of the tracks where he thought it was open ground because there were predators around. He was taken by a python. And I spoke to the person that was involved in sort of finding that body. You know, these things happen. There's a tribe in the Philippines that are quite small, and 25% of the men in that area have been victims of attacks by snakes. So we are very much in the sort of eye of these things. Army ants. If you're quite drunk and you fall down in a ditch, it's possible that they might end up taking a few lumps out of you, but that's the basic situation with them. But nonetheless, it has occurred. Bears, again, they're big predators. We are small, fleshy things, so occasionally that happens too. But really, the sort of top three when it comes to human-predator interactions are lions, tigers, and crocodiles. So let's take a little look at each of them. Here's the lion. This is going to be a very familiar story here. Huge reduction in range. All the red area on there is the historic distribution of lions. You can see going up into the Balkans, across Turkey, potentially into the Iberian Peninsula. Lions were widespread. cross into Asia. Like all of that's gone now. There's a small pocket of lions that live in the Gir forest over here, probably about 700 or 800. Over there, they're doing quite well, causing some problems for the local people. But generally, lion population is massively fragmented now throughout Africa. Probably around 24,000, but you can argue over the numbers until the end of time. Some people say there's as few as 10,000. That's not true. That's not really supported by any of the facts. Some people say as many as 30,000. That doesn't seem to be particularly supported. It's somewhere around there, right? Huge reduction in numbers. And of those lion range now, Tanzania has by far the largest population, probably around about 12 to 15,000. So lions have decreased greatly. Why have they decreased? It's the sort of the trident that's against them, and we'll see this for all the predators. Habitat loss, because we need land for farming predominantly, or we like to clear fell forests and then burn and then farm and then mine and all the other things that we like to do. Prey depletion, because we like to hunt the animals that they like to hunt and eat them. And if we take the prey away, predators can't eat them. And then finally, and one of the biggest sort of causes of problems for predators is persecution, active persecution, because these predators are big and fierce, right? They eat livestock, they will take us, but more importantly, whether they do or they don't, and however many they take, we fear that they'll do that. And we can act on that fear by wiping them out. And we have done. You know, I work quite a lot with rhino, and one of the main problems, of course, with rhino at the moment is people are poaching them and killing them for their horn because of all sorts of traditional medicine benefits and other things. Right? That's the main problem. But actually, the reason why they were eradicated down to very, very low numbers originally was because they're really dangerous to have around farmland. And so people would come in and kill them so that they could farm. Yeah, we just got rid of them because they were inconvenient. So that fear is a big driving influence. And I said earlier that Tanzania has the sort of highest population of lions, and it's a really good case study in some of these sort of examples of human-wildlife conflict. The first thing to realize, though, is that when we look at the map of the world, the traditional projection of the world, we have no concept of how large some of these areas truly are. Until has anyone spent any time in sort of Southern African areas? They're vast, aren't they? You just drive for hours and hours and you've hardly moved on the map. It's staggering. Miles and miles of bloody Africa. That's what people used to say. And it's huge. Tanzania looks quite small there. Right? It looks kind of tiny. It's bigger than Spain, Italy, Portugal, Belgium, and most of Wales combined. I had to get Belgium and Wales in there because that's how we know the area, right? But it's only the 13th largest country in Africa. Right? These countries are vast, and that's an important thing to bear in mind because it influences some of the conflicts that we see. It's got a human population of around 64 million. It's increasing. The East African demographic bubble means that these areas are increasing in population, but it's about the same as the UK. So you often hear people going, well, there's, unfortunately quite a lot, when you start looking at human-wildlife conflicts and predators, you do uncover some quite unpleasant attitudes, and one of which is that there's too many people there anyway. Well, there's fewer people than live in the UK spread out through much larger area. Some of these countries are not as populous as people think. I had someone tell me the other day that there's far too many people living in Namibia. That's why they have problems with wildlife. There's about 2 million people that live in Namibia. It's huge. Right? It's our view of this part of the world is really quite heavily, let's say what it is, often it's quite racist. Right? We need to engage with the realities of some of these countries. And there's lots and lots of reports. Tanzania has quite a high level of human-wildlife conflict when it comes to predators. So you've got lions wreaking havoc as they raid a village, a couple attacked by lions, Tanzania relocating lions because of attacks, all sorts of things going on. And there are so many attacks actually in some areas of Tanzania that we can study them almost like an epidemic. We can use similar sorts of techniques to study them. And this is a particular area. It's the Rufiji and Lindi districts of Tanzania down by the coast. And you can see these are the number of attacks per district over a sort of 5 to 10 year period. 200 attacks here. These are validated attacks, verified attacks that are predatory in nature. So this isn't someone cornering an animal. This is an animal entering a dwelling and trying to take them and either succeeding or being stopped, but generally succeeding. And the reason why you know it's a predatory attack is because the victim is half eaten, which is a very traumatizing thing for everyone around, of course, to be involved with. So you've got lots and lots of predatory attacks around these regions, enough for us to be able to start analysing it statistically and working out what some of the features of those attacks are. And I don't worry too much about the details, which is a classically rubbish thing to say when you've got a slide cluttered with words. But the important thing is each of those lines is a statistical analysis that links those attacks to a particular geographical feature, urban, bare areas, grassland, and so on. And you can start using heat maps and all those sorts of things to try and work out what's going on. Because once we know what's going on, the idea is that we might be able to mitigate it in some way. And well, various different studies have been done, but what they were able to show within a sort of 17-year period, over 1,000 people in Tanzania were attacked and killed by lions. And that's a low end, right? Because we know many of these attacks go unreported. And people will disappear and they're not found and no one's quite sure what happened. It's quite possible they were taken by a predator. And these are predatory attacks. These are lions entering buildings. I interviewed someone who told me a terrifying story about how a lion was literally crawling up the outside. And a wild lion is not like you see in the zoo. A wild lion is a terrifying thing. And it was climbing up the side and sort of flowing over the tops of these buildings. In some cases, people are living in quite rudimentary grass sort of buildings. Lions will just walk right through the wall and take people while they sleep. And these attacks are happening. Almost certainly within the last few days, someone will have been killed like that, without doubt. Very, very common that people are attacked in their homes or around their homes. Going to the toilet, which is a particular problem for women because of privacy issues and fear of being attacked. They're often having to go further and further outside of settlements in order to go to the toilet, which exposes them to being attacked, or being drunk. And there's a particular part of Tanzania someone was telling me about where lions are actually able to identify the gait and distinctive sort of behavior of drunk men at certain times of night and will lie in wait by the side of the road for a snack. That's essentially what's happening. So don't wander around drunk in the bush. True numbers are likely much higher. Agriculture plays a big part in this. Agricultural practices. This will be a typical agricultural setup in this area. And what happens is you've got these big open fields of cleared areas where they're growing crops, things like maize and sorghum and so on. And because bush pigs, just up here, will come and raid that, people will stay out at night to guard the crops and chase the pigs off. But of course, bush pigs attack lions. Now, I don't know if anyone's ever seen a bush pig, but I'm sure you can imagine that kind of like wild boar sort of thing. Quite a, tricky prey item compared to someone sitting on a platform asleep. And so what happens is bush pigs come into the crops, lions go after bush pigs and then find easier meals. So people are being attacked because of their agricultural practices. So what's the actual risk of being attacked in this area? Well, there are about 15. This is based on the lowest number, right? Because we know that there are more attacks that are going unrelated. But there's about 15.5 attacks per year in that area. There's around 450,000 people. The average lifespan is about 56 in that area. So you're actually proportion. If you're walking around, your chances of being attacked is less than 1%, quite a lot less. And so it's quite tempting to look at that and go, well, it's not really a big deal, is it? But when COVID was hitting, I looked up my chances of dying from COVID, and it was approximately the same as my chances of being killed by a lion in Tanzania, right? Except for the fact, of course, that if you're a farmer in Tanzania, maybe your chances are a little higher than just the baseline rate. But it was about the same. The second that text came through saying I could get a vaccination, I was down at the fire station in Cheltenham, right? Yeah, it's a low risk, but it's not a risk I was willing to take. And so it's very easy sometimes to look at these raw data and go, well, it's not going to be a big problem, is it? It's a big problem if you're facing it every day. And if your family, almost everybody in these areas, from studies that have been done, almost everybody knows somebody who has been attacked or killed by a lion. Just as all of us in this room, sadly, probably know someone that died of COVID. Right? Those proportions and risks are not dissimilar. More than that, though, if you go and speak to the people in these areas, the fear of being attacked and the perception of being attacked is very high. 53% of people thought it was very likely they were going to be attacked. 69% were worried about being attacked. Now imagine if you had to go through your everyday life with that level of fear. Aside from anything else, and you can talk about sort of the problem of stress and all of that and physiological effect, that is not a good way to live. But in these areas where these predators live, people are living in existential fear of being killed by a large predator. And that's a lot to live with. That burden is mostly felt, of course, by the rural poor. But despite hundreds of people potentially every year getting killed, I've never seen a press report about it until I really started digging down. And yet, this is what happened when a Dutchman got sneezed, and no disrespect to him. You know, he was a field worker. He was working for a research camp in the Okavango Delta and was attacked by a lion. He didn't die. It was a very moth-eaten old lion that had come into camp. No one had a firearm, so they had to chase it out by throwing elephant dung at it, which doesn't feel like the most effective way, but hey-ho. It went out. Eventually it was found and shot. Yes, wildlife researchers fight off lion by punching, flinging elephant poop. You know, it writes itself. That was all over the story. That was the most read story on the BBC. It was absolutely everywhere. Yeah, white European has camping incident suddenly is national news. I know what the guy looks like. He's got pictures of him. Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you. I've seen people walking around who would dismiss wounds like that because they've got far worse. And this is, I'm not sort of belittling it, but really not that bad. All over the press. Same as with shark attacks and crocodile attacks. The European on holiday gets attacked by a crocodile, it's front page news. But then the story disappears and no one thinks about the background of it. And, you know, it was, the guy was all over the news. But when you look at what media coverage you can find of rural people in these areas getting killed or attacked, it's very, very different. First of all, it's very rare to find it. This is one of the few examples where it's reported in the British press. It's from the Evening Standard. And it's worth reading this through. A teenager has been killed by lions attacking a group of cattle herders in Nairobi National Park. The only reason this was there is because Nairobi National Park is quite well known and it's part of the capital, right? If it had been a more far-flung national park, it wouldn't have made the press. Kenyan police have said a wildlife service ranger said the 18-year-old man was mauled to death and his body mostly eaten after two predators struck around 2 a.m. And then it goes on about some problems. Kenya capital enjoys a boom in apartment and road construction, an expanding population centre, right? Basically, there's too many people. That's the trope that's here, right? Too many people. It's putting heavy pressure on Kenya's famed wildlife, especially its big cats. And down the bottom here, the men should not have been grazing cattle in the park. It is restricted, especially at night. Victim blaming. Well, that's what we see almost all the time when you study the press of people being attacked. If it's a white European, it's fine. It's a big story. They've flung elephant poo. If it's a local person, if it's reported at all, it's generally their fault. They shouldn't have been there. Those 3 kids, you may remember, or you may not. 3 children were killed in Tanzania in the Masai Mara area about 3 years ago. They were looking after cattle. 2 of them were treed. One of them was treed actually and survived. The other 2, his friends, were eaten. I think his brothers were eaten in front of him. And most of the press was, what on earth were they doing in this area in the first place? They were looking after cattle because that's their way of life. So we get no family detail, no photos, no naming, almost no coverage, and victim blaming. It's very, very common when we see this. And it's noticed by people that live in these countries that we seem to care more about wildlife than we care about people. And that's a big problem when you're trying to do international conservation. It's a big problem. So what can you do? Well, actually, quite a lot of what you can do is relatively straightforward. If you corral your cattle at night, it makes a huge difference to the number of predatory attacks because predators are initially attracted to easy meals like domesticated cattle and so on, and then they start picking on people. If you remove that resource, they'll go elsewhere. So simply erecting a boma and putting cattle in it can make an enormous difference to your attack rates. Fencing off areas. This is a typical kind of dwelling. Lions can get into that. So you can sort of strengthen dwellings. But it's basic development, but it requires resources. And it's not glamorous resources. You haven't got, you know, celebrities going out digging wells, right? It's pretty everyday stuff. But if you do that, you can reduce attacks. You can also haze predators, blowing sort of trumpets at them and banging pans and letting off shotguns and so on. That can also work, but it's time consuming and requires resources. So there are ways of doing it, but nonetheless, when it comes down to it, if you're living and working in areas where predators live, you're exposed to that risk. And unless those predators are exterminated from that area, which is not what anyone wants, but unless they are, you always have that risk around. Let's have a look at another predator then, a tiger. Poster child of modern day conservation from the 70s, really. Same story, massive contraction in range. Tigers were once quite widespread, now they're much less so. The yellow areas of their current range. And it's exactly the same features. Habitat destruction, active persecution, prey depletion. These are the problems driving tigers down. And tigers reach really a very perilous state, there's no doubt about it. But in fact, and we don't see this reported anywhere near enough, tigers are rebounding. And they're rebounding very well. Nepal was the first country to double its tiger population, which it did a few years ago. India has almost certainly achieved that now, and a couple of other range states are on the way. Tigers are doing relatively well. The numbers now are pathetic compared to what they were, yes, but compared to what they were just a few decades ago, they've really done very well. And that, unfortunately, has come at quite a cost to local people. And I mean daily attacks. You know, this year, it's no exaggeration to say that within a year, easily 500 people will be attacked and killed by tigers as prey items. And I get the photographs daily, they are prey items. Some of these areas are really struggling. The Bardia National Park in Nepal did fantastically at increasing their tiger numbers. And then within a 9-month period, more than 10 people were killed in that area. And the reason why was COVID, mixed with some local quarrying. It's a very complicated story, but basically people were guiding tourists around, and so they got money and they would be in covered vehicles, and then the tourist industry stopped like that, and so those same people then had to make ends meet, so they started going into the forest on foot, which immediately exposes them to tigers. At the same time, there was a quarrying plant where they started diverting water, which meant that the river dried up slightly, which meant that predators were able to cross over much more freely than they were before. And it also concentrated game animals in particular areas. And so you had all of these factors acting together, and suddenly very, very high numbers of human-predator interactions, which is bad. And we see it across parts of India now. Corporate manager threatens to spoil the party for merry holidaymakers. It's kind of a light-hearted thing. Actually, that particular tiger was killed at the rate of about 1 a week. Tiger kills 1 of 3 men. Kerala, Indian minister's tiger cull comment sparks row. Classic predators, right? They're there. We almost drive them to extinction. We start to bring them out of extinction, and we're doing quite well. Then there's too many of them. We start thinking, oh, maybe we should be culling them now. Right? We need to get out of this sort of endless loop. But this is a real thing. This is going on in India now, massively underreported. Big cats are killing people. But not all areas are equal, and a particular hotbed of human-wildlife conflict in India is this region here, right on the border between India and Bangladesh, called the Sundarbans. And the Sundarbans is basically an area about the third the size of Wales, and it's mangrove swamps. It's just a big sort of swampy area, basically, but it's quite population dense. But it's not big. And there's a tiger-related death at a minimum once every 10 to 12 days in an area about the third the size of Wales. So you imagine sort of South Wales across from the Black Mountains down. Every 10 days or so, there's another news report and someone's just been killed and eaten by a tiger. And that's what we're dealing with there. As with Tanzania, sadly, there were enough deaths for us to start throwing some statistical analysis at it. Most of the victims are men, 45 to 60 years old. Most of the attacks occur in forests. Tigers don't generally like coming into habitations, though they will. But they don't generally. They generally occur during the drier months, and almost all the attacks are on people having to enter the forest for products, particularly fishing. About 50% of the attacks are actually from men fishing from the bank, throwing nets. And if you think about that and the process of sort of having to throw a net from the bank and the focus that's required, you're not necessarily watching your back that much. And tigers are very cunning. I spoke to someone who tracks tigers and tracks man-eating tigers in this area and others, and he says you can see from their spoor that they will sit and wait, and they'll come back and they'll learn people's patterns. You know, these aren't random attacks. They are very specifically looking at particular people who they think are weak or small or particularly distracted. You know, they are very, very good at what they do. And unfortunately, what they do is sometimes kill people. Now, the impact of tigers' attacks can be particularly complex. And this is a nice, an interesting story. that shows our sort of relationship with tigers. So in this area, there is a goddess, the lady of the forest, called Bambibi, and she is venerated by Hindu and Muslim residents of the Sundarbans. So she is the sort of goddess of the forest. And people will go and they'll pray to her and offer her sort of gifts and so on to keep them safe in the forest, because her arch nemesis is Datsun Rai, the demon king and lord of the south, who is believed to take the form of a tiger that attacks people. So you call upon Bambibi when you enter the forest to protect you from tiger attacks. Now, if you get attacked by a tiger, that means that Bambibi doesn't think you're worthy of protection. And that is a major problem for the women who are left behind, because it's predominantly men that are attacked. What happens is you end up with what has become known in the area as a tiger widow. And those women are shunned by the society within that area, physically and sexually assaulted, ostracized, very high levels of suicide rates among them, because of the links between sort of religious culture and the forest and the tigers. And that's a very, very difficult sort of sub-lethal effect, if you like, to get around. So, you know, we're talking about sort of people being attacked and killed, but in Tanzania, you've got the fact that people are walking around in mortal fear. Here, you've got extra sort of ripples from those attacks. So these things really do sort of echo out. And then the third big predator, which also occurs in the Sundarbans, actually, the crocodilians. We've got various different species up here. There's about 23 species in all. You've got Nile crocodiles. There are basically a handful that are known to attack and kill people. Black caiman, American alligator, rarely, but has happened. Nile crocodile, very much so. Saltwater crocodile, very much so. The mugger crocodile in India, which is now increasingly rare, but is an attack species, and the false gharial that lives in parts of Southeast Asia. Same story. All of them experience range contraction, decreased abundance, sometimes massively so, lots of conflict. They're persecuted and so on. But on top of that, crocodiles, especially saltwater crocodiles, are killed for their hides. And crocodiles, being an aquatic species, are particularly vulnerable to pollution, water extraction, and dam projects, which link into habitat destruction. So they quite sort of have a lot of things going against them. Here are the species which can take us. We've got black caiman, gharials, alligator there, Nile crocodile, mugger crocodile, and saltwater crocodile. The great thing about a crocodilian, we know one when we see one. You say that to a crocodilian zoologist, they'll kind of go off on one for half an hour about all these little bone differences and stuff. You know, we know what a croc looks like. Sharp end, paddle end, feet. And then we come to, and this is, the crocodiles give us a really interesting example of how something that can be counterintuitive can be true when we're dealing with predators. Killing the perpetrator as a I'm a conservation scientist. I should be sort of saying, oh no, we should no. If an animal has killed a person, by far and away the best thing to do is to kill that animal, and to do so publicly and very clearly. And the reason why is shown by so many different examples, but this is a nice one that shows it. A man was killed in Kalimantan here on New Year's Eve, unnamed, couldn't find his name anywhere, not unsurprisingly, because that's the way it goes. Was killed and eaten on New Year's Eve by a false gharial in 2008, and another man was taken a month or so before, likely by the same animal, this rather stout-looking crocodilian species. Now, that gharial was found, and the video is on YouTube if you want to find it. It was found, killed, and gutted on the dock. And there was no doubt that it was the perpetrator of that particular attack. There were 3 primates found in its digestive system, 2 proboscis monkeys, and a human being. Complete closure. Right? That village were happy. They were satisfied that that animal had been killed, that they were not under any threat from that animal anymore. There was a sense of closure. However, this is what happens when you don't do that. Papuan villagers killed 300 crocodiles in revenge. There was a similar attack in this area, very close to this attack here, which happened a few years prior to it, during which an estimated 1,000 crocodilians of different species were killed in a couple of months. People were just indiscriminately killing large predators. And if you talk to lion biologists, particularly that work in Tanzania, their attitude is very, very similar, and I've not really found many that will disagree. If a lion has attacked and killed someone, it can be identified, and the best thing to do is to shoot it and have everyone know that it's happened. Because otherwise, people will go out snaring, poisoning, indiscriminately killing, and I don't blame them. Right? How long would we put up with it? It's like, you know, this is a terrible thing to happen to a member of your community. It's a perfectly natural thing to want revenge. And I think we need to be mindful of that. Crocodiles give a really good example of where development can really, really help, because crocodiles live in and around water. If you have to live in and around water because you don't have a piped water supply, you are exposed to crocodiles. Nile crocodiles are incredibly common. It is a reasonable assumption that a body of water in sub-Saharan Africa could hold a Nile crocodile. Right? That's a reasonable assumption. It should certainly be your working assumption if you ever decide to go swimming. Right? It's not unreasonable. So, you know, who's most likely to be near water? Poor people. People without resources. Very, very simple things. Simply putting a standpipe in can save lives. There's a place in South Africa in the Kruger National Park which had no crocodile attacks at all for a while, and then in a month period, I think 14 people had been attacked. And the reason why? A tap stopped working, and they couldn't get the pine. Right? So development doesn't have to be big flashy things. Sometimes it's as simple as getting people away from the water. They've actually built now in some areas in India to stop people being killed by mugger crocodiles, sort of steel cages, essentially, like a shark cage almost, that people can go and wash their clothes in the river, but have this cage around them. Right? It's very simple, relatively cheap, but still requires funding. Now, if you want to go and chase funding and you come up with some shiny, glossy project, you're more likely to get funding than you go, can you give me some money to build some cages in the river? It doesn't attract very much attention, but that's what we need. Because if you protect the people, you protect the animals. And that's really a very useful sort of thing. So leads me on nicely to the idea that we can actually pivot these things around. Right? Predators impose a huge cost. They do. This is a saltwater crocodile. Now, if I asked you where do saltwater crocodiles live and where do most attacks happen, I won't, but if I did, I bet most people are thinking Australia. Well, I certainly was. If you look on the croc attack database, and sadly there are enough attacks that is an ongoing document online, I think the year I looked, I started writing this chapter in February, I looked at the list. There were 28 attacks by saltwater crocodiles that year. The 27th was the only one in Australia. All of the rest were in Indonesia. I looked online at news reports. I could find barely any that covered crocodile attacks in Indonesia. If you look online at news reports and in papers, you would imagine that saltwater crocodiles only attack people in Australia. Very, very rare, but it attracts attention. Most of them are happening up around here. Right? But you can turn the presence of predators into a benefit. And saltwater crocodiles are a great example of that. And some of you may disagree with what I'm about to say, but saltwater crocodiles make very excellent leather. Right? For some reason, these big, old, gnarly, the biggest of all the crocodiles have the smoothest and best leather to work in the fashion industry. The fashion industry loves working with saltwater crocodile leather, finest grain. And in the post-war period to the early 1970s, there was completely unregulated market hunting for saltwater crocodiles. And they were absolutely almost annihilated. They went down to approximately 1% of their biomass, probably 5% of their numbers during that period. It was completely unregulated, winner-takes-all hunting for them. Extinction loomed large. So various Australian states brought in protection from them through the late 60s and early 70s. And by the 1980s, there was a six-fold increase in their numbers, which has continued. And one of the main reasons for it continuing is not tourism. Tourism is one reason. Tourism is a great way of getting numbers up or getting people interested and getting money in, but it doesn't work everywhere. So tourism is a wonderful thing. If you can crocodile tours, people want to go and see them in their natural habitat, but you need infrastructure to develop that. You need to be near an airport, you need to have roads, and you need to have hotels and stuff. So it can be a great thing, but not always. And also, of course, tourism can be quite problematic. This is a common sight. You go to any popular Southern African national park, you will find massive groups of safari vehicles around with lion sightings. What really helped saltwater crocodiles, though, was ranching for skins. So local communities were paid to harvest a sustainable number of wild eggs, which were then brought into facilities and reared up until the crocodiles were about that long, when they were then killed and skinned and sold into the fashion industry. Hermes particularly, other fashion houses don't talk about this much for obvious reasons. But if you've ever seen crocodile leather, it's come from ranched crocodiles. The communities benefit from the crocodile presence because they get money for harvesting the eggs. So they're not so keen on exterminating them, even though they can be problematic, because actually they are a cash resource. The crocodiles benefit, they're protected in the wild. Unregulated hunters come in, everybody knows about it, the authorities get called. Previously, they didn't care so much. Now, they're stealing money from those communities. But we do end up with a situation like this, which, to my mind, is not great. However, without that, sadly, we probably wouldn't have saltwater crocodiles anymore. And this goes on all the time right now. This is happening in Australia right now. And in other areas, they're thinking about doing it in India as well. So ranching can really help. And then, of course, we also get other forms of exploitation or use, particularly recreational hunting. So there are calls now in parts of Australia to recreationally hunt, trophy hunting, essentially, saltwater crocodiles. That probably won't come in. At the moment, if you want to hunt a crocodilian, you can hunt Nile crocodiles throughout parts of their range in Africa, and alligators are commonly hunted in the southern United States. It's a very fraught and complex topic. If you want to read more about it, I've written a book on trophy hunting, which isn't for sale outside, so I'm not plugging anything. But if you do want to buy it, go online right now, because we finally managed to persuade the publishers to lower the price of the ebook to a fairly reasonable £20, I think, from their previous unreasonable £140, which, yeah, exactly. We're like, no one's going to buy that. It's a good book, but it's not that good. So, yeah, it's a fraught topic, but trophy hunting is a way. Recreational hunting, charging people to go and kill the animals, is a way to get money in, which can then help with conservation. It can and does help in some areas. It absolutely doesn't help in other areas. It's a tricky one. Right? It's a fraught topic. And then we also get some unexpected benefits of predators, which are quite interesting. This is a spotted hyena, and hyenas are fantastic at scavenging. They're also amazing hunters, which they're often ignored for, but they're fantastic hunters too. In one area outside of a village in Ethiopia, spotted hyenas ate 207 tons of carcass waste annually. That's a lot. Right? So you get a lot of hyenas around. Now, those hyenas were allowed to forage on that area, and it kept them off. Hyenas love one thing more than anything else, it turned out: donkeys. Hyenas absolutely love donkeys. And people keep donkeys there for all sorts of reasons. That generates conflict. But actually, let them take this waste, right? It's waste, human-produced waste that builds up in the corner. It stinks, it stagnates, and it causes disease. And it's been estimated that 5 anthrax and bovine tuberculosis infections in people was stopped by that foraging activity, and 140 cases in livestock were stopped. It's a tricky piece of maths to work it out. Nonetheless, the figures seem pretty robust, and they were able to put a cost on it. And that cost was $52,000 that was saved by that community by hyenas foraging on waste. And again, that's a benefit of having them around. It's pivoting it around and saying to people, look, I know they're a problem, and occasionally they might take a donkey, but actually look at this other thing that they do. And people will buy into this. Most people that live in these areas, they don't want to go and extirpate everything. They have a very deep cultural relationship with many of these animals, very deep. But they also have a very deep cultural relationship with their family and other people, and that tends to trump that. So if you can find ways to pivot things around, it works really well. This is an interesting story, slightly hypothetical in some respects in terms of the numbers, but this is a puma or a cougar or a mountain lion or a catamount or any of the other 36 names that it has. They eat deer, and deer cause road traffic accidents, and they cause enough road traffic accidents, they get their own abbreviation, a DVC, a deer vehicle collision. It's a common form of collision in parts of the continental United States. Now, cougars are doing far better now than they were, particularly over in the western side and central United States. And it's been estimated that if cougars were established in the eastern United States, where they're not doing so well, they could reduce deer density enough to prevent 21,400 human injuries and 155 fatalities within 30 years, saving $2 billion. Now, that's a great argument on paper. I would suggest that's not the strongest case to put to someone if they're opposing predator introduction because they're a sheep farmer or they don't want to have cougars around. You go, well, listen, yeah, within 30 years, we could hypothetically save more than $2 billion, right? People aren't going to buy into that. But nonetheless, it's an interesting benefit of having predators around. They are reducing DVCs and they are providing a cash saving. And there's lots of these sorts of things that predators do in the background that we don't think about. Ecologically, they're incredibly important. Predators structure environments, they increase biodiversity. We like having predators around. It is exciting to be in an environment where there are predators. Recreational walkers and so on enjoy the landscape more, knowing there might be bears around. People are attracted to these areas. They won't enjoy it if they get attacked, but people like being in areas where there are predators. I take people down to South Africa quite frequently. In Southern Africa, it doesn't matter that they claim they're a botanist, or they claim that they're an entomologist, or they're really fascinated by leeches or whatever. I guarantee the second you get in the back of a safari vehicle, there is one animal they want to see above all else, and that's a lion. Everybody wants to see big predators. We love them, but we have to find ways to get some benefit. So human-predator relationships are complex, right? They're complex historically, politically, culturally, spiritually, biologically. We have a very complex relationship with predators. And there's absolutely no doubt that predators can be extremely harmful to individuals and communities. Those costs are not felt equally around the world. They're not felt by us in this room at all. But we want to live in a world where there are lions and tigers and wolves, I assume, right? But we don't feel the cost. Predators can bring tangible and intangible benefits, but there's often a disconnect between the people that want predators in the world and the people that pay that price. So what can we do? And this is what I'd like to finish with. The first thing we can do is to stop thinking that conservation is about animals. Okay, it isn't at all. I spent a very enjoyable week driving around Namibia with one of the heads of conservation down there. She's actually the head of an umbrella organization that covers almost every organization in Namibia that's involved with conservation. And she's a very garrulous person. She's a great company. We talked incessantly on very long drives. And we spoke about conservation almost without fail. And we talked about roads and politics and microeconomics and macroeconomics and history and post-apartheid politics. And we talked about water supply and electricity and roads. And we talked about women in politics. We talked about language. And we talked about almost everything. We very rarely mentioned animals except when we drove past one. Oh, there's a giraffe. Oh, yeah, that's nice. Anyway, you were talking about it because all of those things are actually what conservation is about. Because when you take care of the people and you understand their relationships, you can take care of the wider environment. So it's really, really important that we understand that. And it's also important that we listen and that we listen to the right voices. We tend, particularly in this country, but also in the United States, we tend to think that we should listen to, conservation scientists, right? We should listen to celebrities. We should listen to entertainers. We should listen to Joanna Lumley, right? No. Listen to the people on the ground that live with these animals and have done for centuries. They know far more than we know about this. We need to listen to these people and we need to empower them, right, to be able to do what they need to do. We need to include. We need to include, not exclude, and support, don't impose. We think of conservation as something that's done to people or done to an area. No. The most successful conservation strategies are not fortress conservation where we erect a fence around and exclude everyone. Right? They don't work. They breed resentment. The most successful conservation are community conservancies and community forestries and so on that include people. The reason why Nepal was able to double its tiger numbers before any other range state is because of the community forestry that goes on in Nepal. In Nepal, communities own forests and they own the complete rights to do whatever they want with them. Now you would think, oh, that's a terrible idea. They'll just fell all the trees. No, they won't. They won't fell all the trees at all. They manage that forest very, very sustainably, very well. And as a consequence of that, predators like tigers are rebounding in those areas because the people that are managing those forests get enough benefit from those forests to be able to allow tigers back in, and they want to do that. Right? When you empower people to conserve their area, they do, and they do it really, really well. The other thing we need to do is to accept complexity. Right? It's very, very tempting to look at some of these situations and go, well, that's obviously wrong, or that's obviously right. You know, trophy hunting being a case in point, it's obviously terrible. I remember the first time I was exposed to it about 2001 on a trip to Zambia. A friend of mine's family owned a game farm there, and they were telling me all about it, saying absolutely horrendous. You know, you've got people coming down here spending thousands of dollars to just go shoot something, right? But then I thought, well, hang on, this is the only area I've been in that's got any wildlife in. Why is that? Well, it's because it's the only area where wildlife is actually valuable. Outside of those areas, it was farming everywhere and charcoal burning. So these things are complex. You know, the sort of the deity worships that go on in the Sundarbans, trying to understand the relationship people have with tigers and trying to get into the conservation of those tigers requires us to understand those spiritual relationships. And then I think the biggest problem that we have maybe is lack of empathy sometimes. I spend a lot of time on social media and a lot of time looking at people's responses to these things. You see images like this being posted and all kinds of people weighing in about how terrible it is. You know, this leopard here had, over the course of several months, killed dozens of children. And by killed, I mean predated them, carried them away, half-eaten them, and then people, because big cats generally eat half their prey and then come back to them later. And that's what's found. You know, and a friend of mine tracks these animals and finds those corpses. And he now sends me images and I just don't open them. Yeah, it's horrific. Daily. Well, those villagers eventually managed to corner that leopard and they beat it to death with sticks. Do you know what? I don't blame them. Right? We need to have some empathy. Okay, because when we forget that, we end up with all sorts of tragedies. So thank you very much for listening. It's a tricky case, it's not the most uplifting topic, particularly after those lovely children here talking about their marvelous pond. I was sat at the back there. It's a tricky act to follow. But it is an important topic, I think. It's important that we sort of understand all these relationships and things. And if you want to learn a little bit more about it, then yeah, I've written the book. But yes, thank you very much for listening. And I finished just in time for your exciting AGM as well. Has anyone got any questions they'd like to ask?
I've got an interesting family story. My grandfather was a mining engineer in southern India between the wars.
Right.
And he killed the tigers because they were predating on the villages.
Yeah. Yeah, and it would have been back then. I was trying to work out what the sort of death rate would have been if you extrapolate back and you look at some of the written reports, and it would have been thousands of people a year would have been taken without doubt.
The tigers got a taste for human flesh.
Yeah, and at the time as well. So some of these areas now which have got tigers rebounding, you've got a dual problem because you've got people who are no longer used to moving around a forest environment with tigers in because generationally they haven't. So they haven't really got those skills. And then you've got tigers who have no fear of people because no one's been hunting them since the 70s. But back then, you would have had tigers that also had that fear and people that were able to move around. And despite both of those things being in place, very, very high numbers of people being taken. Yeah, particularly on those big infrastructure projects and the Save rail, you know, the Save man-eaters in Kenya with the big railroad and stuff. When you've got high densities of people in an area, huge problems. Sorry?
Crocodile, which is eating the mother and daughter.
Yeah.
And we had their rings that came out of the body.
No way. Yeah. So, yeah, that would have been a mugger crocodiles in India. Yeah, they're really struggling from a conservation perspective now exactly because of that behaviour. You know, they're going to get persecuted. Who wouldn't?
What about the wolves which are trying to introduce?
Yeah. So one thing I've learned with wolves is never to speak about wolves because you can never win. They are just, yeah, they're a tricky one. So there's no doubt that wolves will and have attacked people. However, it's relatively rare. And in modern day settings at quite low densities with wolves, there's very, very few reports. And they don't seem to be causing much of a problem in a lot of the areas that they've been reintroduced to. But there is a fear that they might do. I think it's problematic. And I think 5 years ago, before I started looking at this in any depth, I would have been quite dismissive of people's fear of reintroduced wolves, because I would love to be walking around the Highlands and see wolves. But now I'm kind of a little bit more empathetic, I guess, with people who are fearful about them. But I think probably the risk to humans is low, but it's not zero. It's not zero, and that's inevitably a problem. I think that the real issue would be, we introduce wolves and it all goes swimmingly and it's great, but if there's even one attack, I'm not sure how we would deal with it. I'm not sure how we would weigh those odds. I mean, lynx. People getting stressed about walking around a woodland with a lynx, I think, probably need to read a bit more biology. But lynx would be an easy reintroduction, I would imagine. I think we should have lynx in British woodlands, but wolves are a bit more problematic. I would love there to be wolves, and I've heard people say, "Oh, you can erect a wolf-proof fence," and I would say that anyone that says that has limited experience of either wildlife or fencing, because I remember doing a field course actually in Margam in South Wales, where there was a deer-proof fence that had been put up. And I was explaining to this group of students, "Oh, there's a deer-proof fence here." And literally on one side was a deer, and on the other side was a deer. And it's like, not really helping, is it? So I think all this idea that we can contain these animals as well is tricky. But yeah, it's a hard one. And wolves are very divisive. People are very polarized about them, but I'd love to see them back.
With the exception of wolves, are these other predators, are most of them sole attackers, or do they attack in groups?
Mostly on their own. Yeah, mostly solitary. Lions will attack in prides, but generally it seems that when people are taken, they seem to be lone males dispersing, or older lionesses and so on. There's this kind of injury idea as well, that some of these predators are injured. Jim Corbett in India was a big fan of this sort of injury hypothesis, because a lot of the man-eaters, the big famous man-eaters that he shot, had injuries, but that doesn't seem to be necessarily the case. But yeah, generally it's most of these predators are acting alone, if you like. But yeah, certainly wolves will not.
And hyenas.
Yes, well, hyenas can be particularly tricky if there's a group of them. I mean, a spotted hyena, a big female particularly, is a formidable looking animal, and you can see the way that some of these animals will attack us. So hyenas attack us in the same way that they would attack another medium-sized prey animal, so they go for the face and the neck. And quite often it seems people are able to fight them off. But one of those sublethal effects of predators is when hyenas attack, if people do survive the attack, they're usually quite hideously facially disfigured, which often in remote rural areas they're unable to get, there's not a maxillofacial surgery just down the corner, so you can end up with all kinds of long life effects of that, which is awful. Yeah, hyenas are scary beasts. Yeah.
Your talk focused on predator attacks. Comparative figures for attacks on humans from other non-predators like people.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things I was going to bring up was that elephants are a major issue in some areas, and it's the thing that is feared, I think, more than predators. So I did a radio program where we were outside the Pilanesberg National Park in South Africa, which is a fenced area, heavily fenced, and we were trying to get, it was about lions and stuff, and we were trying to get some local people to say, "Oh, there are lions." But basically, we wanted someone to say, "Well, there are lions in the park," and we're a bit scared of them. They weren't scared of them at all. It was elephants that frightened them more than anything. Elephants and hippos probably kill more people than crocodiles, maybe. I'm not sure. It's hard to get real numbers on them, but certainly elephant fatalities are very common. I would say probably, from reports that I get, at least 2 or 3 people a week in Zimbabwe are killed by elephants, at least. And that's not even the highest areas. Botswana is a big area where elephants are problematic, because they'll park up within a village and they'll eat crops, and then people will go out and try and chase them away, which obviously goes badly for elephants and for people. So yeah, in terms of actual numbers, no, I'm not sure, but they're certainly high. Buffalo being another problem in some areas, although they're much less common now outside of national parks.
Do mosquitoes count as predators?
Well, that's an interesting one, isn't it? So ecologically, they're grazers, because they take a small piece and move away. But yeah, of course, mosquitoes, vector diseases, which dwarf these numbers. That's another issue when you're talking about numbers with these things. It can become very, very easy sort of, you know, oh, 1,000 people got killed here and 300 people got killed there. And you start, but once numbers get to a certain size, and I'm sure there's studies on what that size is, you no longer think of them as people. They become a unit of population. And it becomes easy to dismiss. But yeah, certainly in terms of overall numbers, yeah, mosquitoes are far more hazardous to us than lions. But we're not so scared of them. We probably should be.
So where do polar bears fit in your top 10 of predators? Are they big because the ice is melting?
Yeah, so polar bears are an interesting one. So they will attack people, and they certainly do. It's relatively unusual that people come into that closer contact with them because they're quite sparse. In terms of whether climate change is affecting them, the jury is still out in terms of whether that's influencing their behavior in terms of attacks, but it's certainly influencing their distribution, and it's likely to start pushing them closer towards people. And that's the big problem. It's the same problem with things like cougars and pumas and bears in America. There's been a massive uptick in people going out hiking and people going out into the wilderness, and that hasn't necessarily, as it was put rather coyly in the paper, hasn't necessarily correlated with an increased ability to thrive in outdoor areas. So you're getting a lot of people who will walk down to sort of, you know, the local outdoor shop, strap on a pair of boots and go walking through bear country, not carrying bear spray, which is basic, right? If you ever go and just buy bear spray, it works. It's actually more effective than a firearm, bear spray. And the reason why is because most people aren't Clint Eastwood in the movie. Most people, when it comes down to it, when a bear is charging at them, can spray a spray, but most people won't be able to draw a gun and put a bullet in, unless you've had a lot of training. You know, the fact is, most people think that, you know, you can shoot an animal like that. You can't. It's on you. Those animals can cover, you know, the length of this lecture theatre in fractions of a second. You have no chance. So actually, bear spray is at least deployable by most people. So yeah, buy bear spray. That's my parting words. Buy bear spray. Shouldn't be a problem around the Cotswolds yet. I say yet though, because bears would be a good thing to reintroduce. So bears would be a cool thing to have, right? We used to be bear habitat here, brown bear, very widely dispersed. I think they thrive here. I think they do well.
Is the taste for human flesh hereditary or taught? I mean, are there certain type of individuals or families that like the taste of human flesh and other family groups don't?
There's not a lot of research on it, but there's certainly that thought. When people have studied some of these attacks in depth and tracked individual animals, there is the fear that particularly cubs will be learning from their mother how to hunt. And if part of that hunting spectrum becomes humans, then that becomes a learned behavior. And there is that concern, yeah. And what's also happening, interestingly, and it's not been well documented, but it seems to be certainly anecdotally, is that tigers are having more cubs than they used to. Like they're bringing up 3 or 4 at a time. So you're getting, if you do end up with a mother, a tigress who is targeting humans, you potentially have quite a lot of disciples who might be following in that behavior. And much of it though depends on opportunity. And that's the other problem when you've got fragmented forests and you've got an expanding tiger population. So the way tiger territories work is that you get a male with a huge territory. I mean, these things will cover 30 or 40 miles in a day or two. And within that, you've got smaller female territories. So a male's kind of patrolling around the area. Now, a big, fully grown male tiger is not going to tolerate any other male tigers in that area. So they will get chased out. So what you end up with is lots of cubs surviving. Half of them are going to be males, statistically, and they are not welcome in that area. So they get chased out. Now, when you have massive forests covering, you know, half of India, they have space to move, but now you don't. And so they're moving into farmland. So you get young, inexperienced tigers struggling in marginal areas where you've also got lovely, weak humans walking around. You know, we have poor senses relative to a lot of prey animals. We're very good collectively, and we've developed plenty of technology to defend ourselves, but most people in those areas don't have access to that. So you end up with a problem of these, sort of an ecological problem where these younger tigers are being pushed into human areas, which is not going to get any better, sadly. I mean, there are already now groups talking about reintroducing recreational hunting of tigers because there's a bigger population. You've got problematic tigers. I spoke to an American hunting organization that reckoned that you would be able to sell a license to shoot a man-eating tiger for over $1 million, and someone would buy it like that. Now, that's a lot of money for some of these community areas. So now you've got people going, well, maybe these tigers will be a money. So now we're going back in time and starting to do things which most people don't want to do. But meanwhile, you've got tigers expanding out and killing people. So you've got all these conflicts going on, and there's no easy answer to any of it. But I want to live in a world where there are tigers roaming about. But I don't think I'd like to live where I live, just north of Gloucestershire, taking my kids to school with an existential fear that one of them's going to take me, you know, because it could happen.
We've heard stories in the press in the past.
So predators live in this country.
Things like that.
It's a hard one, right? I got sent something by it was the Echo or the Citizen. They phoned me actually and said, can you come down to the office? We've got these like amazing pictures of like a black, it's always a black panther. They're quite rare, but it's always a black panther. Can you come and see the photo? I was like, no, bluntly, I'm not going to waste my time. Why don't you email it to me? And they're like, well, we're not sure it's secure. And it's like, just email me the photo or don't email me the photo. If you email it me, I'll take a look. So they emailed it to me, and it was a cat. I mean, it was the domestic cat. And they were like, so I phoned them. I said, yeah, it's a black cat. And they said, how can you be sure? And I go, because it's a black cat. Like, look at it. And they're like, yeah, but it looks quite big. It's like, that's a dandelion. Like, literally, it's like a dandelion. And so I've never seen any convincing evidence that there are. The other problem is, if there were any sort of population, I'm sure at times there probably have been after the law changes in the late 70s or something. I'm sure that there were some turned loose. But if there was any sort of population of those animals, we would see signs of it. We would see carcasses. Sheep farmers would be up in arms because these animals will kill every other day minimum, right? And they'll kill what they can. And you also get what's called the fox in the henhouse syndrome, particularly with leopards. If a leopard goes into a goat kraal in places like Namibia, they will kill every single goat. 50, 60 of them done, they'll take one. Right? They get crazy and they'll just kill all of them. We would see that in this country. We'd see these behaviors. We'd see, people that I spoke to a gamekeeper a while ago about this actually, and he said, he goes, I know if a stoats walked across this ground. He goes, how come no one's ever found any prints? All these areas where they're supposed to be seen, you've got people out all the time, country people that know what they're looking at, know weird tracks. They know, we don't see carcasses in trees. We don't see any of these animals, and there's never been any good. So I love the idea that they're out there, but the evidence just doesn't support it, sadly. And also, why are they never regular coloured leopards? Why are they always black? They're always black panthers, always, and about the size of a monkey. But they do look. Yeah, I don't think I've seen a single convincing photo.
We just took a big ginger tom in Minorca a couple of years back. From a distance, you think, oh gosh, it's a lynx or something.
Yeah.
And I said to her, I'm hearing lynx here, and she understands. I typed in the laptop, it was a big ginger tom.
Yeah, yeah. But the thing is as well, once your brain once you think something's, I'm terrible at it for birds. Like I always want to see something unusual, so I'll be having like proper birding people, and they'll be like looking around, and as soon as I see anything that looks even remotely different, I immediately go to like some rare thing, and it's not. It's just some variant of something I've not seen, and my brain's getting carried away. But yeah, I think there's a lot of that going on too. Yeah.
Is there anywhere where predators are actually culled, or are the numbers so short?
Are culled? Yeah, I mean, in South Africa, they cull lions regularly, in national parks too, but they never speak about it. The problem with lions is that they breed like cockroaches. That's an actual quote from Fred Packer, the big lion expert. They are remarkably good at breeding. If you've got enough animals for them to eat, lions will just expand and expand and expand. Tourists want to see lions, but if you have too many lions, you have to keep introducing game into the area for them to eat. So you end up with a problem. And if you're in a fenced area where they can't move out, and you've got communities around you, then yes, they are culled in those areas. I was trying for about a year to try and get some numbers on this, and all I could get was people telling me that it occurred. They would never tell me to what extent it occurs, but they breed very well. Crocodiles are culled in some areas when they cause a problem, but again, generally not so much. There's cause to cull leopards in India now, but in Indian animal rights politics is quite fraught and complicated. mixed in with a lot of religious and spiritual sort of angles as well, so that becomes quite problematic. But leopards, I didn't talk much about leopards, but leopards are a real problem in India at the moment, a major issue, and they're attracted into urban areas because of feral dogs, and there are millions. The last estimate I saw was 80 million feral dogs. I'm sure there are more, and leopards love dogs. Hyenas love donkeys. That's one thing I learned. And leopards love dogs. And everyone in Africa that lives in the leopard area knows that. Like, they'll keep their dogs in at night and stuff. And leopards will single out dogs. So that's a major driver of that conflict. I sense your AGM is about to be.